so I'm going to spend some time describing different kinds of experiments that some that I've done, some that have been done by other people, relating to the connection between the settings of one's life and one's emotional and sometimes cognitive state. And reflecting always back to this idea of vitality, that I think that successful design is one that promotes the same kind of sensations that I felt standing on that glass of cold field that morning. So that's, as I said, those aren't my kids. That's not my son, who's got a much worse haircut than that. So here's, for the longest time I've been interested in the work of Christopher Alexander. And if you've looked at his books, especially his 4-volume opus, this image and some of the other ones that I'll show you might be somewhat familiar to you. And in this part of his work, well, actually most of his work, he talked about this idea of life and recognizing life and vitality. And so he, in this case, presented image pairs, and asked a simple question: which one of these images contains more life? So by show of hands, is it the left or is it the right? There's a strong consensus that it's the right. Okay, let's look at a few more. What about this? Is it the image on the left or the image on the right? Again, a strong consensus, not unanimous. Thank you. All right, I think I've got a couple more. What about this? The image on the left or the image on the right? Image on the left? Image on the right. Okay. Again, strong consensus, and I think one more. Image on the left. Image on the right. So I don't think we had any cases of unanimity. We had a few abstainers, I believe. But strong consensus in each case. And one of Alexander's points was that generally we may not be able to pinpoint very accurately why it is that we might say that one of these images has more life than the other. But we know the life when we see it. We know the elements of a scene that make it feel vital. And my argument is that ability to be able to recognize and respond to life is deeply biological. And so some of the experiments that I'll describe to you today relate to that idea. So here's the conjecture. We are universally attracted to and nourished by vitality, and that I've already said this one, I think that one of the most important elements of the success of any design at any scale, from urban to interior, and most of the things that I'll show you today will be urban scale, is the extent to which it taps into this deep, biologically rooted craving for life. Okay, so here are some examples. This is usually the most popular slide in my presentation, so I'm sorry to say we've just hit peak Colin. In fact, I showed this slide at a conference in the summer, and at the end of the talk, I said, "Are there any questions?" And the first person who put up their hand said, "Can you show us the drunk octopus again?" Here it is. Okay, you're laughing. You're laughing maybe because of the text, but you're laughing because of something else as well. Look, it's here. What do we see? Well, what about here? We're finding these things amusing, presumably, because they look a bit like faces. There is a phenomenon called pareidolia to some extent or another. Almost everybody experiences this. We see faces in things that are definitely not faces. So this is, as well as being kind of amusing, and these are kind of off-the-wall examples that I'm showing, this is actually something that's very deep, because as it turns out, you've got a little piece of your brain that is specialized for recognizing faces. I'm showing a picture of a brain just to prove that I actually am a neuroscientist, because otherwise, how could I have done this? You're looking at the ventral or the undersurface of a brain. The areas that are highlighted in red are part of what's called the fusiform gyrus, and for all kinds of reasons, we think this is a brain area that's specialized for recognition of faces. And so, it's really interesting and sort of makes sense that we would have a brain area that does this, because as human beings, being able to recognize other individuals, and especially being able to recognize their facial expressions, is a kind of skill by which we can literally live or die. It's a fundamental part of our ability to be able to get along with other people, to understand other people, to be able to do all of that. So, one idea is that the reason why when you look at something like this, you see a face, is because what's actually happening is that your perihippocampal gyrus, your fusiform gyrus, or fusiform face area as it's sometimes called, is pointing at that thing, and it's lighting up, and it's saying, yeah, there's a face. So, if we play with that idea a little bit more, here's some work. This is not my work. This is the work of somebody named Michael Ostwald. So Michael Ostwald said, well, in those kind of trite cases that I just showed you, where it's fairly evident and obvious and maybe a little bit easy to find a face in those images, what about other kinds of images, maybe images of built structures that are not obviously face-like? And you can see a couple of structures here. As architecture students, I'm sure that you recognize both of these things, the Francoid right on the left, and the Le Corbusier architecture on the right. So Ostwald's idea was to take what we now have in abundance, and it's working everywhere, whether you recognize it or not. We have lots of very interesting and sophisticated software that's designed to recognize faces and even to process information about facial expressions. So this is being used more and more widely throughout the world to surveil the goings-on of human beings. Ostwald said, okay, let's take that software that's designed for pointing at faces and let's point it at buildings and see what happens. Of course, buildings aren't faces, but maybe if you point the algorithm, so to speak, at a structure and ask it about the facial expression of that structure, then it'll give answers. And maybe those answers will reflect people's real experiences of pieces of architecture. So here's an example, just a diagram of what happens when you point a facial expression algorithm at the Le Corbusier house. And Ostwald's finding was that, yes, indeed, the algorithm did point out that there were differences in the expressed emotions of those two pieces of architecture, and to the surprise, perhaps, of not many, I think, the algorithm reported that the Villa Savoy was quite a bit angrier than the Frank Lloyd Wright structure. So, I don't know how far you can take this kind of approach, but the idea here is that maybe part of our reaction to the appearance of at least the externalities of a building might be based in these deep biologically rooted algorithms that we use, maybe sometimes for other things, in this case for the recognition of faces. Okay, another kind of example. This is a streetscape, obviously. It's a streetscape that I think most people would agree is teeming with complexity. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is the design of facades, exteriors of buildings, and the psychological impact of those facade designs. So here's one example of a very complicated set of facades. The question is, what does that do to your mind? Here's another example of a different kind of set of facades. Many people might say that this is maybe something a little more attractive, maybe in the language that I've used sometimes, maybe something that's more psychologically sustainable, something that perhaps might have a more beneficial effect on people's behavior and their feelings than other kinds of streetscape designs. So some years ago, I set out to try to find a way to study all of that. And so I designed a kind of experiment. So I've done quite a few of these now. It's a field experiment. And the idea is that we take people out into the world, we take them for walks through urban settings, and we measure their bodies, and I'll get to how we do that in a second, and we ask them questions about their experiences. So this is an example of an experiment in progress. This was actually the first of these experiments that we did on the streets of New York City. We took people on a walk through the Lower East Side. And you can see that at this point our methods were relatively unsophisticated. You can see the handsome fellow on the left is actually the facilitator for this experiment. He's explaining things, and all of the people standing on the other side, you'll notice that some of them are holding clipboards with papers on them. And so that was, for the most part, our form of data collection. So we would take people from one place to another in cities. We would ask them questions. These days, this is a more recent image. This is very staged because all of the people that you see here are students who have worked in my lab at one time or another. And you can see that now they're all looking at phones. They're not playing Pokemon Go. They're actually responding to questions that the phones are asking them about the setting in which they find themselves. And you'll also notice, if you look closely, that they're wearing some interesting fashion accessories. The three people on the right side of the image you'll see have these kind of band things around their heads. I'll talk more about these later. These are devices, really simple, essentially consumer-grade devices that are designed to measure a little bit of brain activity, basically EEG measures from people's heads. And the young woman on the left side of the image, again, it's a little bit hard to see, but she's wearing what looks like a pair of safety glasses, and what those glasses are doing is actually measuring scan patterns of her eyes. So we're monitoring exactly what she's looking at. I won't be talking anymore, almost at all, about scan patterns so much, but I will talk a little bit more about brainwaves eventually. But the idea is that in addition to simply taking people places and asking them questions about what they see, we like to use biometrics as much as we possibly can to interrogate the body about people's feelings. And one of the things that was actually in the last slide that would have been very difficult to see is that we often ask people to wear bracelets. These bracelets measure the same kinds of things that something like a Fitbit might measure. In other words, they measure heart variables, but they also measure something that interests me a lot, something called skin conductance. So the idea it's not that easy to implement. The idea is pretty simple. The idea is that when you are physiologically aroused, and by that I mean either positive or negative arousal, and we all know that there can be both kinds of arousal, but when we are physiologically aroused, there's a response from the sweat glands in our bodies. And we can measure that response with a simple method which relies, in this case, on wearing a bracelet with a couple of sensors. The sensors pass a very low pulsive current one from the other, and the measure is the resistance that the pulsive current encounters in going through the skin. And that varies according to the state of the sweat glands. So it's a really nice, theoretically, really nice, simple window into the arousal state of a person. What you're looking at here is a graph. This is kind of a proof of principle. Again, this was taken from a quick experiment that we did in the street in New York. We had people walk across a fairly vexed crossing where they had to watch for taxis, they had to watch for buses, they had to watch for cars, and they had to get across the road fairly quickly and intact. And what you're seeing here is that those wiggly lines represent skin conductance, and you can see that arousal basically is going up when people cross streets, which all by itself, that's not a bad thing. Of course, we don't want to be sleepwalking our way across the street. We want to be alert and vigilant, so it makes sense that we want to have high levels of arousal. The problem could be if we live in circumstances where that level of arousal is chronically high. So we know that when physiological arousal is high and stays high for long periods of time, that's bad for us. That causes unhappy kinds of, for example, hormonal events. The secretion of the stress hormone cortisol will go high and stay high, and we also know that that kind of circumstance is associated with disease, with cardiac disease, for example. So if we live in conditions where arousal is chronically high, then it will eventually increase the likelihood of disease, and it may even, over the course of time, kill you. Here's another illustration of the use of skin conductance. This is, again, from one of these early studies. You might recognize this as just a Google Earth image, again, of a part of the Lower East Side in New York City. You can see this blue curtain, and the height of the blue curtain represents the average level of arousal of a group of people walking the streets along this route. And again, you can see that physiological arousal waxes and wanes. You can see some levels of areas of high arousal near the top of the image, and if you look towards the very bottom of the image, you can see that the lowest level of arousal we measured took place when people were exploring a beautiful little community garden, a surprisingly beautiful community garden in this part of the city. So again, kind of proof of principle here. The idea is that, but also the idea that your level of physiological arousal as you walk the streets of the city is rising and falling for all kinds of reasons. It might be noise, it might be automobile stress, it might be other kinds of events, but it's happening, and this is just very negative. So what we did with all of that was to try to find a way of, as systematically as we could in a field setting, exploring the impact of the design of facades on people's psychological and physiological states. And so here are a couple of snapshots of different locations in two different cities. The left side again shows New York, and you might recognize again my facilitator standing against the wall, waiting for participants to finish reporting. And on the right side, a streetscape from Berlin. I should mention, by the way, that we got to explore these interesting places in connection with a fantastic project that ran some years ago that was, believe it or not, sponsored by BMW in affiliation with the Guggenheim Museum. And the idea was to design kind of a traveling think tank to study urban issues. And so there was physically a lab, a structure that was placed temporarily in cities for a period of about 10 weeks. And during that period of time, there were lectures, there were workshops, there were movies, and there was an experiment. And happily, I got tagged to do the experiment. So the first version was in New York. The second version of the lab was, as you can see here, in Berlin. The third was in Mumbai. I'm not sure if I'm showing you any Mumbai today. The original plan was to do this in 8 cities, but after 3 cities, we had spent all the money that BMW was willing to give us, so we kind of had to stop. So both of the streetscapes that you're seeing here are what we might describe. You might describe them as high complexity. Sometimes some people would describe these settings as high permeability, meaning simply that there are lots of ways to go into or out of this particular streetscape. And we compared them with other streetscapes that looked like this. So, and there he is again, the facilitator standing, he's got all the pictures, and each one holding his phone and looking into space. On the left side, again, you can see this is a low complexity, low permeability facade. Again, in New York City, this is actually the front of a gigantic Whole Foods store that was quite controversial when it was placed in this part of the city. And you can't really see this in the image, but that glass that you can see is actually frosted. So as you're walking down this block, you can't actually see any detail inside the structure at all. And on the right side, this is a facade of believe it or not, this is a restaurant in Berlin that has no windows. And again, I think most people would agree that this is low complexity low permeability. And so we measured a bunch of things. Here's again another view of, and this is all staged. The person on the left is demonstrating now. You can see the better UI tracking here. The others are somebody's peeking at someone else's phone there, but they're wearing visors for EEG. They're also carrying phones. So we're measuring biometrics while people are standing in front of these different kinds of facades. Here's one of the things that we found that, before I get to the main finding, this is kind of interesting, I think. When you're doing biometrics in the field, it's very, very hard. The data, as you can probably imagine, is very, very messy. And a lot of people these days would lead you to believe that you can extract a lot of information from these biometric signals that you really can't because of the mess, because of the noise. But some things work kind of well. So this is an example of a very small-scale study that we did. This is actually a little bit of data that we collected in Brooklyn, where we, again, took people to different kinds of facades. We had them just rate the complexity of the facade, so look and give us a number between 1 and 7 of how complex you think this setting is. And while doing that, we also measured the number of times that they blinked. The reason that we're interested in blinking is because blinking is not something that you just do to lubricate your eyeballs. It turns out that blinking correlates with cognitive processing. So, and this is a handy thing to know when you're watching, for example, if you're trying to detect whether or not someone is telling you the truth. Watch the eyes. When we're thinking really hard, when we're processing information, our blink rate increases. So the finding here, again, this is really small scale, but tantalizing that when people are placed in front of facades that they themselves rate as being higher in complexity, that blink rate increases. So it's a somewhat more objective measure. Rather than simply asking someone, hey, do you find this complex? We have another way now of measuring complexity. Because presumably more complex streetscapes produce a little bit more effortful processing. Here's what happens with skin conductance. That's the measure that we use the bracelets to collect. These are our values relative to baseline. So we take a baseline value before the experiment starts, and then we take people to different settings and we measure physiological arousal. And the finding here is that with low complexity streetscapes, physiological arousal is lower than baseline. With high complexity, physiological arousal is higher than baseline. Now, if you were listening closely to something that I said a couple of minutes ago, you'll recognize that this doesn't really tell us everything that we want to know about how people feel, because physiological arousal can be high or low, and that can either be a happy or an unhappy thing. So if you're in a beautiful green space, for example, you'll find that people's physiological arousal levels go low, and that's not a bad thing. In this case, to dissociate those valence variables, we also asked people to self-assess how happy they were feeling in the moment in those two settings. And so, in this case, you can see the fancy scientific nomenclature here in the form of emojis. We found that people standing in front of the low complexity facade reported lower levels of positive affect, or rough proxy for happiness, than people standing in front of the high complexity facades. So this gives us a little bit more information now. It tells us that when people are standing in front of these low complexity facades, they have a combination of low skin conductance, low physiological arousal, and low affect, low feelings of happiness. And that is the classic signature that we know from all kinds of other studies, the classic signature for boredom, which maybe in some respects is not all that surprising. When you stand somewhere in front of a really low complexity streetscape where not much is happening, not only does the arousal state of the nervous system go low, nothing is engaging it, but also people aren't feeling really very good about that. And boredom itself, one could argue, has public health consequences. For example, there are other studies that show that when you make people be bored, and I have a colleague who is expert, this sounds terrible, but he's expert in making people bored. And it's not not through his lectures. His methodology consists of having people watch long movies, and the movies show individuals hanging laundry on clotheslines. When you do that to people for long enough, they of course become bored, and when that happens, they begin to secrete more cortisol. Again, the stress hormone goes high in conditions of boredom. There are some other pieces of evidence that suggest that people who experience chronic levels of boredom throughout their lives die sooner than people who don't. So there's a relationship between lifespan and boredom. So I'm not trying to argue here that if you build a boring city, people are going to drop dead in the streets. But it's plausible that there's an actual public health impact here to bad design. If you design parts of the city in such a way that that city is not psychologically sustainable, it doesn't do the right things for the human body and brain, then you are hurting people, you are harming them, you are causing disease and shortening their lives. And that, even if that's something that's very gently incremental over the course of a lifespan, it's still something that I think is significant. Okay, I have no idea how I'm doing for time. The slides say I'm halfway through. I'm about halfway through. All right, I want to talk about nature. So this is becoming sort of a well-trodden tale now, in not only in environmental psychology, where this story was born, but also in the public realm. People hear all the time these days about how nature is good for us psychologically. And most people have heard one or another kind of account of what environmental psychologists call restorative effect of nature. And the idea here is that, as most people know from personal experience, if you are in a stressed state, if unhappy things are happening in your life, if you're overloaded, one of the things that we know can help is exposure to nature. Walk through a park, even sitting on a bench in a small urban parquet, as it turns out, has psychological benefits. There are different ways of thinking about what all of this means. One of the things that we talk about a lot is the effect of exposure to mostly urban environments that require a lot of focal attention. So think of walking again, think of the idea of walking through a busy city street. There are all kinds of things that you must pay attention to. So there are things that are competing for your attention that may not be important, but there's a lot of stuff as well that you need to pay attention to. Thinking back to the idea of crossing the street, you have to have focal attention, you have to know where things are, you have to avoid bumping into people. Well, it's better if you do. There's a lot of demand on attention. And the idea is that over the course of time, continuing to pay focal attention to settings causes depletion. That we can't maintain focal attention for very long without that resource, that capacity being exhausted. So in some of the experiments that we've done in our lab, we tried to test this. I'm going to show you a quick demo. I always do this. And this is no exception. I'm going to inflict this demo on you as well. This is a task that we use called the Sustained Attention to Response task. We have a field version of this that works on the street, and there are also lots of lab settings. So it's a short animation, and when it starts, you're going to see digits flashed one at a time. And every time a digit appears, I want you to clap your hands. So can we have a practice? Can you clap? Perfect. So you're going to see a rolling display of digits, clap every time you see a digit, but when you see the number 3, don't clap. Okay, that's it. You did exceptionally well. I think there were 3 threes there where I did not hear a single clap, and that's not the usual thing. That's pretty good. But you noticed that there were some others where there were some claps. In fact, there was one where there were a lot of claps. And so the moral is that this is something that is deceptively hard. You think it's going to be really easy. It turns out it's not that easy to maintain vigilance on a rolling display of digits and to perform a simple task. Imagine being an air traffic controller. This is the kind of thing that taxes you, that you need to maintain vigilance on something for long periods of time. Imagine being a hapless Psych 101 student in my department doing this in a laboratory setting where you might be asked to do the SART task, as we would call it, for even sometimes as long as an hour. It's very difficult and depleting. It's entertaining to hear the salty language that comes out of the testing booths when we ask people to do the SART for that long. In field settings, we use a period of about 100 seconds. We have 100 digits presented 1 to a second, and rather than clap, you're pressing a button every time you see a digit. So we can get nice measures of attention from people, and then we can measure the effect of exposure to natural environments. So this slide, we've done this both, we have a lot of stuff going on right now in the real world. We've also done this in virtual reality. So I'm going to show you, this is a little bit dated now, but it's still pretty good. This is the video that you're seeing is actually taken from one of our experiments. This is taken from somebody wearing a head-mounted display. So imagine that you're not seeing this as a movie. You're immersed. You're seeing this in 3D. And the movements that you see here, they're not just being presented to you statically, well, not statically, but they're not just presented to you passively. You're actually making the movements by traveling through a natural setting. So in some of our earliest experiments on the restorative effect of nature, what we did was to design settings that look like this, to compare them with urban settings, to cause psychological stress to students. And it turns out that we're actually pretty good at making students feel pretty bad. Many of you might already know that from other contexts. In our case, what we did was to have people write down the worst thing that had happened to them in the last 6 months. And we didn't read their accounts. We didn't want to, because we didn't want to feel as bad as they did. So we just shredded them. But we had them write them to elicit negative affect. And then immediately afterwards, we had them wear headphones. The headphones played sounds of street construction, jackhammers, people yelling, horns honking. And while they were listening to that, we were asking them to do fairly complex mental arithmetic. So multiplying a 3-digit number by a 3-digit number in your head. So get a student who comes into the laboratory in kind of a happy-go-lucky state to do that for a period of about 15 minutes or so, and they are depleted. We know this. And then, following that, we presented them with either a natural setting like this or a control urban setting and measured the restorative effect. And I won't show you everything, I'll just show you one little snippet. Here's the snippet. What's being shown here, this is a measure of, again, skin conductance, and the idea is that if you look at the left side, that shows baseline before anything happens. The middle shows what's called post-stress or time 2. So this is immediately after all of the nasty things that we've done to people. There are 2 lines, one for the control setting, one for the natural setting. And the third, on the right side, the third pair of dots represents what happens after VR exposure. And you can see the big difference. So the big difference is telling us that we can psychologically restore people quite quickly, even in this really contrived artificial virtual reality setting. Over the course of about a 10-minute exposure, people are in the space. You can see the nature line actually goes below baseline readings of skin conductance. And we have analogous kinds of findings for cognitive tasks and self-reports of affect as well. So nature is powerful. We know this. We know less about why that is. There are lots of different ideas. One idea has to do with something that we find in abundance in nature, and that is what are called fractals. So fractals, quite simply, are well illustrated by the fern frond that you see here. And what's being shown, obviously, is replication at a number of different scales. So the overall frond has one shape. The next level down, a frondlet has a similar shape, and so on and so on and so on. This is a property that's found in abundance in nature. And one idea is that it's that fractal nature of of the stimulus that is responsible for the restorative effect. So there's a very interesting, this is not my work now, this is a work by a physicist actually named Richard Taylor, who experimented with this idea by presenting people with different kinds of fractal images. So fractals can vary one from another, and measuring psychological responses. And he found that there was a sweet spot for, it's called the fractal dimension of the stimuli, that produced both the highest levels of preference and also the most relaxation according to biometric measures. And that sweet spot happens to reside at around the same level of fractal dimension as is most common in scenes of nature. So that's one idea about why nature is restorative. Here's something to read. I showed you the visors earlier. Here's a more close-up view of the visor. These things are marketed by a Canadian company as an aid for meditation. Just between me and all of you, I think the idea that you need something like this to meditate effectively is kind of fun. If you need this kind of technology to do that, you're not doing it right. But I would never tell the company that makes these devices that, because they've been kind to me, although I guess I sort of just have. And we've hacked the instrument that you see here for use in research. So the idea here is that this device has a series of sensors laid out across the front of your head. Theoretically, we're able to measure EEG from frontal cortex using these devices. And so we've done that with people in different kinds of settings. And one of the things that we've looked at is nature. Here's a scene from a study that we did in Toronto. This is a nice little urban parquet. Here is a streetscape with not very satisfactory buildings, but some trees and some bushes. And here's another streetscape with some not satisfactory architecture and low complexity as well, and no nature. And so what we did was to measure what's called alpha activity. So alpha activity is the kind of brainwave frequency that one would associate with feelings of relaxation. And we measured the power of alpha activity in different kinds of settings, and those bars are telling us that the highest power of alpha is produced in the greenest kinds of settings. So again, there's a couple of things about this. First of all, this is taking findings about the power of nature from the laboratory into the field, but it's also suggesting that there's an orderly relationship of some kind between landscape architecture and psychological effect. That we would predict from this that certain kinds of designs, again, would have particular kinds of effects on the human brain and body, and that the right kind of landscape architecture, if we know what it is, and we're still trying to find out, would be the most beneficial thing for the human brain and body. And just as I described earlier to you, this idea that there's a specialized area in the brain for processing faces, there's also, as it turns out, a specialized brain area for processing scenes, and that specialized area loves scenes of nature, as it turns out. So there's a couple of things being shown here, but the main point is, first of all, if you look at the diagram at the top left, that's obviously a brain diagram. You can see these little patches of high activity. Those patches are in what's called the parahippocampal place area. So this is a brain area that's specialized for processing scene information. It's also a brain area that is happiest, most active, when it's being presented with scenes of nature. And interestingly enough, the reason why this part of the image is here is to remind me to tell you that that part of the brain, as well as being interested in nature, is rich in a particular kind of neurochemical receptor for naturally occurring opiates. So when we find systems in the brain that use naturally occurring opiates, they're most often associated with reward or drive systems. There's lots of these kinds of receptors, for example, in the parts of the brain that subserve drives for feeding or for sex. So the idea here is that if those kinds of opiate receptors are also found in abundance in this part of the brain that's specialized for processing scenes, and maybe especially likes scenes of nature, then there's kind of an arm-waving argument to be made here. There's lots of data that we don't have yet to suggest that there may actually be a deep biological drive that propels us towards scenes of nature that has the same kind of underlying structure as other drive systems in the brain for other kinds of rewards such as food and sex. Okay, I think I have time to finish the story. So the last work that I want to tell you about, Suchi mentioned this in her introduction, but I'm interested in the peripheral visual field. So the last bit of what I have to say relates to that. It's new work. It's work that I've been doing in collaboration with Robert Condia, an architect at Kansas State, and a crack graduate student of mine named Jatish Srikantaraja. The starting point for this is to think about how your visual system works. And you may or may not realize this. I'm sure have some sense of this intuitively, that your visual system is actually more than one system. There are a couple of different subsystems, one of which is in charge of producing very high resolution color parts of an image. That's in the center, the fovea, and the rest of the visual field, the periphery, is only capable of low resolution. It's very sensitive, but it can't resolve fine details, and it doesn't really have much to do with color. So the image that you're seeing here is meant to represent all of that. The retinal image is inverted, there's color near the center, and detail, but towards the outside of the visual field, in the periphery, we don't have either. And so we've become really interested in understanding the relative contributions of the center and the periphery to people's appreciation and understanding of especially architectural interiors. The very complicated slide that I'm showing here comes from a paper not written by me, but written by Condia and his collaborators, which describes this idea that there is a separation between the responsibilities of central vision shown in the bottom part of the image and the responsibilities of peripheral vision shown in the upper part of the image. So for a useful kind of shorthand to understand what we're thinking about the contribution of center and periphery to what we understand as architectural atmosphere. So atmosphere is one of those things that's easy to recognize and not quite so easy to define, but as architecture people, you, I'm sure, have a sense of what I mean by that term. When you enter a room like this one, when you enter a structure, even something at urban scale, it has an atmosphere. You can feel it. And so the question is, where does that come from? And can we unpack the origins of architectural atmosphere in terms of the design of the visual system? So we tried to tackle that by using methods that to some extent are sort of crude at this point, by presenting people with settings in which they either don't have the center or they don't have the periphery. So you'll see a bit more of the methodology in a second, but the idea basically is to present images lacking the center, as you can see here, or presenting images that are sort of tunnel vision-ish, where you've just got the center and not the periphery. So the question is, if you find ways methodologically to do that with people, then what happens to people's understanding and impression of architectural atmosphere? So one of the things that we've been doing is to present people with very brief exposures to scenes. So this slide is showing an example of one such experiment. There's a mask, there's a black field. Following the black field, there's a briefly flashed scene. In this case, the flash scene is missing the center that contains the periphery, and then following that presentation, there is a blank mask reachable. And so if you can make out the numbers on this slide, you can see that the times that we use for these displays are exceedingly short. The shortest display time is 50 milliseconds. So a 20th of a second is how long that image flashes on the screen. And the question is, what can people tell us about the image so briefly flashed? And the answer turns out to be actually quite a lot. So what this graph shows is that if you ask people to rate the pleasantness of a scene flashed for a brief period of time, even as short as 50 milliseconds, and that's the set of bars on the extreme left, then they will rate natural scenes as higher in pleasantness than scenes of urban settings. With exposures that short, it's very difficult for people to report to you what they actually saw. But nevertheless, if you force them to give you a rating of pleasantness, there are significant differences between the pleasantness of natural and urban settings. We're still kind of a long way from architectural atmosphere here, but we're at the beginning of a story that suggests that your peripheral visual field is exquisitely tuned to aspects of your surroundings. This is a different kind of study. These are called chimeric images. If you can make these out, you might see that there's a center and there's a periphery to the image, and the center and the periphery of the image is showing two different kinds of things. And so the question is, if we present, again, for a very brief period of time, if we present these images to human beings and ask them questions about them, what do they report? In this case, we ask people to basically just tell us what they saw. And so you'll notice that the vertical axis is referred to as gist identification. So gist is a word that we use in psychology just to suggest exactly what it sounds like, getting the gist of something, getting the first approximation of what something is. And in this case, we ask people to identify the gist of these images, and we found that their identification, the correct identification of the image related to what was presented in the periphery rather than the center. So again, suggesting that we're very tuned to the peripheral visual field. We're also have done some stuff in virtual reality. Here's a picture of the setup with three happy, smiling students, not at all staged, they're always happy and smiling like this. Here are the settings that we built. Condy was in charge of this. We compared what's called your classical setting on a modern setting. Sometimes we've called this a flash bulb setting or flash peak setting. And so what we wanted to do was to find a way to present people with two different kinds of, in this case, architectural styles, and to measure whether or not there were differences in their responses to them in VR, and especially whether we could fractionate differences depending on whether they were presented with the central or the peripheral visual field. And so, again, this was a first crack, so we did this in kind of a crude way because we had to. We have better methods on the way. But I'm going to show you a short animation which shows a movie of a walk through one of the environments. And you'll see that it's flashed. The reason that it's flashed is because we wanted to preserve the image to being either in the center or in the periphery of the visual field. And this was the best tool that we had to do this job. So the task of the participant was to maintain fixation here on the crosshair as the video proceeded. And so you'll notice that the scanning is all gone for this route, so it's not really central for you. But the idea is that central vision was missing. People in this condition would only be exposed to the peripheral visual field. And if you pay some attention to the periphery, you'll notice that we're actually stepping through these environments from one place to another. And the experiment was set up in such a way that when people came to the corridor that separated the so-called classical and modern designs, there was a virtual keyboard of a sort that lit up that asked them to answer a bunch of questions about what they see. And here's one of the findings from that experiment, which suggests that, again, in comparison with comparing the classical and flashbulb designs, this is a measure of skin conductance, which we also did biometrics in this experiment. And again, it shows that the impact of the kind of design, if you pay attention to the rightmost bars, the impact of the kind of design on biometrics differed most when those two designs were only presented to the peripheral visual field. So again, the idea here is that we're incrementally trying to get towards is understanding the contribution of the peripheral visual field to architectural atmosphere. And this may be as close as we've gotten to this point, showing that these two kinds of styles produce different effects on the body, especially when they are only presented to the peripheral visual field and not just the central vision. So again, we think there's something special about this part of your visual pathway. We're on the trail trying to figure out exactly what it is. So this is just the summary slide, the conclusion. As I said at the beginning, I think that understanding the human response to vitality is the key to good biophilic design. That we now have some pretty cool toys and interesting tools that we can use to measure these kinds of responses. And when we apply them to different kinds of materials, the story that seems to be emerging is that there's something special about what's out here. There's something special about the visual periphery that contributes to both recognition of biophilic design and also the emotional response to it. And as I've tried to emphasize along the way, I think that understanding some of these principles can lead to better urban design. As I emphasized a while ago, I think urban design, good urban design can be, in many cases, it may not be much of an exaggeration to say that it can be a matter of life and death, that it's actually so serious as to be a matter of public health. And with that, I will stop.